Is there, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I didn't realize no one's giving me the clue, like we're starting. So I got 38 minutes to go. Hi, I'm Justin Gordon. I flew out here from Maui. My handle on Twitter is Rails on Maui. I'm a Rails freelancer. I'm a poster child for remote work. The guys at 37 Signals, I do that all the time. Work on Google Hangouts, everything. Anyway, I am so stoked to be here. I'm thrilled. My talk today is called Concerns, Decorators, Presenters, Service Objects, Helpers. Help me decide. Well, after I saw David's talk this morning, I realized that wasn't a very good title. Okay. Here's my new title. How to Lose Model and Controller Fat Fast for Men and Women. The ball of mud. How many of you ever experienced that in a Rails project? Well, look, I only learned Rails 3 years ago. I understand how this goes because it's a little bit mysterious when you first start programming in Ruby. You know, where's the natural place to put another line of code? In the same place next to where you need to change something. So it just kind of keeps growing and growing and growing. Anyway, so I love this analogy of the ball of mud. If any of you have kids, like I have a wonderful 5-year-old, almost 6, they don't like to clean themselves. So you try not to get them too dirty, but they like to play. And anyway, I guarantee you, this guy's not cleaning up his mess. And you can have the same analogy a little bit with some software projects too. Okay, when I first wanted to develop this talk, what I wanted to do was I wanted to make it so that I was going to get some real code. So I started asking around the forums. By the way, big shout out to the Parlay forum and ThoughtBot forums. They're awesome. I'm on there all the time. So the Sandy rules. Hang on a second. So how many of you have all heard about the Sandy Metz rules, been following that stuff, shorter stuff? I've been doing that a lot recently. And that's kind of a lot of what got me started going for this talk. So anyway, I wanted to bring up some real code here. So here we got some code from RubyMine, and we got a user model there, 762 lines. We got the account controller there, the lost password method, 52 lines there, 4 levels of nesting. Yeah, that's really not that much fun to work on. Anyway, so how do we organize? So I'm going to be doing is I came up with some examples that are much simpler. I realized that was going to be too hard. So my examples are built on top of Michael Hartel's Rails tutorial. Actually, I'm going to take 1 sec right now and just tell you a little bit about how I came about developing the talk, because I think it's really, really relevant. First of all, I wasn't even planning on giving a talk. I got brought out here by JetBrains and RubyMine. They said, hey, could you go to RailsConf for us? I'd just been a go-go recruit. So I said, I'm not sure if I can go. I go, okay, I'm going to go. Then I see a little Twitter thing. Okay, so last day for conference proposals. And I've been working on kind of applying these patterns to a big project I've been doing, the patterns I'm about to show you. And so then I thought, okay, you know what? What they don't really teach you that much about is when to apply a pattern to a particular thing. And I got all these cool little different patterns. So that was kind of the concept of this talk. And this is an example of what we're going to try to fix. So we got here is how we organize this mess. And an example I got is like a clothing store. You go to a clothing store, and what if they organize the clothing in the clothing store by color? Say everything that's black is going to be, everything that's black is going to be like all in one place. That would be a disaster. You'd have women's clothes, baby clothes, everything, and maybe you're looking for something for men's clothes, and size and whatever. Even among different kinds of clothing stores, those organizational patterns were different. And you can use this analogy by, if you were doing struts versus if you're doing Rails, hey, it's going to look totally different. So, look, like fashion, people's ideas of what is good style will be different. We saw this morning, David's talk is clearly, he's not on the same camp as some other people about what this is. You see we got the left here, business suits, and on the right we have hoodie pro, or dress-up hoodie, I think it's called. Okay, what's our style? Our style is Rails, okay? That is going to be one of the kind of primary topics about what the talk is, because it is not going to be about some computer science like this is the best way, we're going to abstract everything out. The thing I love about Rails that made it just so amazingly productive is the whole ecosystem, the whole community. And part of what that is that you can go online and find the answer to just about any question on Rails so easily. So a big part about what this talk is, or like how the patterns are evaluated is this pattern fit into Rails as it is? Now, a big part of that is who we saw speak earlier, David. So lo and behold, so I put my code up on GitHub, and this is how I developed my talk. All of this code is on GitHub. So you can go there, and it was developed, and I put in a pull request for each of the patterns I'm going to show you. I'm going to do my code samples at the end, because when I tested this out, it was too painful for you to watch me like kind of fat finger something. I've got too much material to cover. So as much time as I have, I'm going to go through the samples. But it's all there on GitHub. And even better than just having code samples there, it's got review content, comments from guys like James Edward Gray. So I go, OK, that's kind of cool. I've chatted with David a little before. I emailed him. Lo and behold, he sends me back a response almost immediately, started giving me code reviews. Like, whoa, this is kind of cool. Code review from, I haven't met David before. Code review from David. So anyway, but needless to say, his code, and so I was kind of like the poster child this morning for even talking about some of these patterns that, you do this, now you have clean code. So I was the guy and got a little bit humbled by the experience. And so we're going to see the benefits of all this interaction. So it's kind of like this talk was like developed through open source, which is something that just didn't happen 5-10 years ago. OK, so here's kind of the summary of where we're going to go in this talk. So I kind of talked to him, and these are exact quotes. I got his permission to use this. This is starting to boil down to the framework capabilities and moving beyond only when is necessary. OK, when you really use an extension, keep it simple. When you use the framework code for what it's intended, you're not cutting against the grain. And that's a key point. So that's what I'm going to be showing you stuff with that in mind. The example I'm going to give you is just to give you a context of the example later on. It's a micro-post example. And let me show you just really quickly. This is kind of fun. You know what? I'm going to show the example at the end because it doesn't want me to quit out presentation mode. OK, so anyway, when I gave this talk before, one of the things someone got confused about was they didn't understand what the examples were about. So this is a little like microblogging application like Twitter. I'm going to extend it, and I'll show you later on, based on having a 5-year-old, how I would extend it for little kids who should not be using profanity or the word poop. So everything's there. OK, so this is the structure of the talk and of where we're going to go. So when we're going to be evaluating code, what we want to do is how are you going to say what's better or what's not? Well, if you're going to have a discussion with somebody, before you even discuss is this better or not, let's discuss what we both can agree on, which are going to be the guidelines. So I'm giving you my guidelines for evaluating stuff and the objectives, and then we'll go to the patterns techniques. So small methods, less than 5 lines. We no longer care about how long it takes to invoke a method in Ruby. You've been programming for many years. We used to be concerned about that. Small classes. That's huge. Actually, and I kind of extend that, even small files. And the reason why is who wants to scroll through a 1,000-line file looking for something? I much rather have stuff broken up into manageable, easy-to-use chunks. One instance variable in a view. There's another thing. It's it's a real pain if you got 10 different variables all being set up in all different places being set into a view. So that makes it easy. So objectives, dry. Everyone should know what that is. Easy to test, and after this morning's talk, relatively easy to test. Clarity, easy to read, easy to find, and easy to change. So the patterns we're going to talk about: concerns. Draper decorators. I use the word Draper decorators, not just decorators, because I'm specifically referring just to using the Draper gem, which I like. And decorators, and the next term, presenters, have lots of different meanings. So for presenters, that's going to be my own little pattern. And split up controllers, I'm not going to talk about that. It's in the pull request. And then move logic to models is one of the topics we're going to be talking about. And validation classes, as they'll be in the pull request. I'm missing one of the main topics here that you probably all came to hear about, or maybe some of you. There's no service objects there. Well, Okay, you'll see shortly. Service objects were originally part of it, but after having some discussions with David, they're not quite there. The pull request is still there, and you can still see the code that was originally developed, and you'll see what the responses are. Okay, so first scenario. So you got a huge model, even a larger spec, so you want to break up the model spec. How are you going to do this? We're going to use concerns. And specifically, we'll try to break it up using domains. I'll tell you what that means in a sec. I'll tell you, when I first started using concerns, a real big model file, and so how did I get, and so what was like the first easy thing to do? I saw, well, the example that David originally gave, taggable. Well, I kind of looked at mine. I got like pages and pages of finder methods that are just, so I don't have like, my queries all over my controllers. So, chunked that into a concern. I called it finder methods was the concern. Then I created one for validation methods. Anyway, David totally hated that. He goes, we break stuff up. We're going to break stuff up by domains. So here's a visual representation of kind of how you use concerns. Say you have a class, a big file. It's got, you need to understand your class macros are things like belongs, has many, validates, et cetera. You got your instance methods. You got your class methods. Now, so what you're going to do is you're going to break out this stuff by domains. So you want to figure out what they are. And then what's going to happen is that you just literally cut and paste. This is the easiest refactoring. I mean, you literally, if your tests were good, you don't need to add any more tests. So when I get to the code examples, I'll show you that. So concerns, how? So how do you do this? So discover the problem, what's the domain? All you got to do is create a concern module with extend active support concern, and then you're going to move code into the concern. And then you're going to break out test. Another thing I really liked doing was when I had this big user model, then I had this even bigger user spec test. What it did was then I had, and this was my original poor example, was I had my finder methods, and then I had my user directory, and then I had my finder methods spec. So nice chunks. Okay, so this is what direct quote from David. In a sea of 60 methods, there will always be domain-based groupings rather than technical groupings. Never seen that not to be the case. At first, I didn't get this whole thing with like domain-based groupings. So the example I'm going to be showing you is called emailable, which is just some properties like the email is always stored in lowercase. When I search for it, I always want to convert the search query into lowercase. That makes a nice little domain, just like his example, taggable. So the next one I'm going to be going through in the code is Draper Decorators. So in Draper Decorators, is the example, so like a good example for this is you have a model file creating detailed validation messages with HTML and URL links. Okay, so this was one thing, and I still actually find this kind of confusing. How many people ever end up with a situation where you need a validation message and you need to display a URL where someone clicks on it to fix the problem? Or you want to put like some word in bold? That is actually view-based, presentation-based logic, but you're supposed to be creating it in the model. And then what happens is then you end up needing to call something like the URL helpers from your model. Now, for a beginner Rails programmer, how confusing is that? Very confusing, because like, whoa, I was doing that in my views and my controllers, no problem. Anyway, basically what the Draper Decorators will allow you to do is any of this stuff you're going to be able to move into this decorator class, because it's basically like imagine concerns, but going the next step for your presentation stuff for your model. So here's like kind of what you got here. You got presentation code, and you got model. And the next thing that we're going to do with the decorators is we are going to break it out. So we got the decorators, and they are basically going to be covering the overlap between, say, the model and the presentation layer. So just like I said, think about kind of like a concern, but if you were making a concern for just your presentation stuff, it's easier to do it with the Draper Decorator gem. Yeah, you could do it with concerns. Okay. So alternatives to using the Draper decorator, if you're doing this, you can make view helpers. You can just make plain old Ruby objects, and you got to pass a context into them. So the example I'm going to be giving is a piece of duplicated code, and I'll show you this once I get to the code. OK, the presenter. So presenters, that's the next one. So this is a pattern. This is very hard to come up with a name for this one. And the reason why is that presenter and decorator are confusing because they have different meanings in the like kind of Gang of Four books, et cetera. So it just means different things to different people. So I asked around, and David gave me a thumbs up on the word presenter for this pattern, and some other people. So that's what it is. So what's the scenario? You're saying like too many instance variables in a controller action, and you've got all these variables, instance variables, accessed in your view. And then you might have a bunch of logic in the view code. And it's just better not to have too much code in your Ruby code in your view code. So what this is going to do, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a plain old Ruby object. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass the stuff we need to in this Ruby object, and that Ruby object is going to be accessed from the code. I'm going to be showing you this pattern a little bit later. I'm going to get into the code. So just imagine, though, just all those declarations for those instance variables. We're going to put whatever information we need to create that, we're going to put that in the parameters for initializing this new object. And that's what I'm calling the presenter. And then your view code will access, say, presenter.micropose, presenter.something. Another great example of how these presenters really help out is when you're using fragment caching. Fragment caching is awesome if you haven't tried it. One of the things that happen when you're using fragment caching is you go and you look at your log, and you say, did this query run? Because maybe you had a slow query. And before, if you were declaring these instance variables in your controller action, what happens? You ran the query, but then you get to your view and you got the cache block. And then, OK, the cache block didn't run, but you still ran the query. So by putting stuff in this presenter object, then what happens is then you access that value, you access it from the view code. And you can memorize very easily in this class. So what it ends up looking like is this. So you have stuff in there, like this is a method declaration for foobar or equals calculate foobar, and this gets called from the view. So it works perfectly with caching. So this is what it looks like. You've got a big controller action, many instance variables, and then you have a view with many instance variables. And just as I was explaining to you, we're going to make a smaller controller action, and we're going to only initialize the presenter instance, no other instance variables. Then what's going to happen is that the view will only use that one instance variable, and will call into the presenter object. The next one we're going to talk about is moving logic to models and the validation classes. So let me tell you what the example is. So, and I've actually got this running, and all you need to do is some simple steps. So I was trying to think, OK, I got the microblogging example app. And then what I want to do is here's the business case for the kitty safe blogger. Is that what it is that if a kid, little punk, right there, he says, Dad is a poop face and fart face. And then what happens is, and that literally happens if any of you have 5-year-olds. I don't know where they get the whole thing with like poop and fart. But anyway, your parents have been notified. And it's going to say, you better watch your language. And you've used profanity 50 times. So we access the user model there, too. And you're thinking, OK, well, so how are we going to write the code for this? I'm going to get into this in just a little bit, and I'll show you that you can just write this out just in the controller, and that kind of makes sense. Especially if you end up with these situations where you need specialized flash messages, and you can't just use regular validation. You think, OK, cool, well, I'm going to make a service object maybe. So that's the business case. So service objects. I've yet to see a compelling make action a service object example in the world. Maybe they exist somewhere, though. Then again, maybe unicorns are real too. Okay, so my examples got reviewed in that context. So what is the service object example that I originally was coming up with? We're going to go take the big micro post create action on the controller. This is what I'll be showing you in the code just a little bit. That's the before. And so the after is, and I thought this was just the coolest thing ever when I was originally doing it, was having a tiny micro post create action. And what we do is we put that stuff into the controller. So, we have a tiny micro post action. We create the service object, the micro post create service object. And what that does, it does everything it needs to do. Great, it's in one nice little small object, fits the Sandy Metz rules, and it's easy to test. I could just test the stuff directly, but the stuff I needed to test was that it sets the flash message correctly, that gives me the right flash message in different circumstances, stuff like that. Well, controller specs are a little bit tricky, so that worked out really nicely. So anyway, then what the code has to do then, once you set up your flash and things like that, is you got to send all this stuff back to the controller. Your response code, your flash, your whatever stuff. Controller needs a bunch of this context to get back to it. And what I found when I was doing my own project was that I was sending that stuff back all the time, so I call that object the controller response. I go, cool. I'm going to present this at RailsConf. This is going to be cool. Okay, but let me tell you, there's you can have like a coworker review your code. There's nothing like putting stuff out there for review to the entire open source world and getting people like David and James to review your code. Anyway, good learning experience. So that was the example I originally came up with the service object. And this was David's response. Sorry to keep shooting patterns down, but this is exactly what I mean when I say that most code does not need patterns. It just needs to be rewritten better. But he was telling me basically to put it in the validator and this and that. And I told him, I think that's a pattern out of the way. The pattern you presented is to use validators rather than a separate object. And he goes, right, that's what Rails has built in. So whether you call them patterns or techniques, the objective is clear code. But so I thought about that. So it's like, okay, so that was a criticism, was I had too much code that was controller specific in my service object. And if any of you have tried to abstract out stuff that was a big thing in the controller, I bet some of you, have any of you ever made that same mistake? You get too much controller stuff in there? A couple of you. Probably more of you probably just left in the controller big. And so then I go, cool, you know what I should do? Because then I saw one of the examples from David, and this is something I actually hadn't done very much, is instead of having one controller class per model, which is what you get when you do Rails generate, why not be able to have just like a controller class for a single action? That way all the private methods and that, everything just concerns that one action. It nicely bundles up the stuff. I go, this is going to be great. So I go and I show it to David, and well, anyway, he didn't really like that one at all, because what I did was I still left the business logic of, say, checking for like the profanity and stuff still in the controller. So what I really wanted to do was move as much stuff over to the models. So this was his response to that pattern. And basically the gist of it is shoving this into a service object is, in my opinion, a lazy approach that doesn't deliver any benefits of simpler code. It's a sweep under the rug approach. So just making a standalone controller wasn't good. So there's just more to it. So the solution was plain Rails. And this is kind of basically it. Just having the controller put as much stuff in the model, call out the models for what they need to do. So here's a scenario. So when you have excessive logic, here are the things you might do. You can move the logic out of the controller into the models, utilizing Rails features such as validation. Or you can create a non-ARA-based model to handle interaction between two model objects. And that's kind of a lot of what people have been referring to as a service object. And this is, look, if you're processing something like payments, for example, or purchasing, you got, say, your invoices, and then you've got, maybe your user object, you've got, product inventory, things like that, complex interaction. Yeah, I think the essence of it is that definitely feel free to create more models, but don't take out stuff that should be in the controller and put it in these service objects. Okay, let's take a look at some code. Let's see. I'm going to hold. We'll do questions. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end. Okay. So once again, this is all on GitHub. Here's the example we'll be going through. Data is wonderful. That post, great. Data is poop. And that's what happens. So definitely have fun with it over on GitHub and take a look at that stuff. Okay, I'm going to go through the examples again. So we're going to reiterate kind of what we got here. So here's the concerns pattern. So the concerns pattern, and I'm going to be reviewing the diffs rather than the code, just because that's going to be a lot simpler. So inner user, what we do is we have several different bits of code here that all concern emails. So what we do is we take that stuff out. So here you can see it's just removed. And here's some more stuff, the email. We've got an email domain checking right there. This just returns the email domain. It's an instance method. Here's the scope. It's a finder. Here's self by email. So that is a class method. Okay, so here's what the emailable concern looks like. So this is the part, like if you haven't done concerns before, hey, here's the secret sauce. All you do is you create a module called, in this case, emailable, and you're going to extend active support concern. And then the next part is this special block here for included. What we're going to do with that is we are going to move all of your class macros in there. This right here is the email domain. So that's just an instance method. So instance methods go at the top level. Then you move your class methods over into this module block. So this module class methods, that's something you got to remember to add. So when you go in here, so there's the code. Now, one thing you need to be aware of when you're doing this is if you just copy and paste, you're going to have this. I can't edit this different here. You're going to have self by email. So that's where you declare those. So when I was practicing this, when I was going to do the whole thing with live code, I definitely made that mistake a couple times. Just cut and paste. You leave the self in there. The other thing it's easy to do is also the other mistake that's easy to do when you copy and paste is put all these scope things, validates your class macros, and don't omit to put them in the included block. So what's kind of nice about the concern pattern here is that when you do this, if you try doing this with just plain old Ruby mix-ins, it takes a bit more to do it. You can't just kind of shove the stuff in there in one. And the concerns module gives you this ability to do the included part, do the module, the class methods, and you can actually nest concerns and it handles it correctly. So that's the concerns pattern. It's worth noting, too, that the concerns are very, very controversial among some segments of the Ruby community because they're saying, you're not actually making better objects. These objects are just as fat. You're just moving the stuff around. And, from personal experience, from having done that, I agree with David on this thing. I think they're absolutely fine. I don't think it makes sense to be creating a lot of extra different classes when these concerns will make the code very nice and clear. This other diff here, what this just shows you is just, hey, I had a lot of code in here that applies to the just testing, and it gets cleaned out. So that's the other big benefit of using these concerns is smaller specs. Okay, I'm going to show you a Draper decorator real quick. Okay, with Draper decorator, this is like super simple how you get this stuff working. All you got to do is put gem Draper in. Then here's what the decorator looks like. Let me show you what I cleaned up first. Okay, so here's some duplicated view code. In this view code here, what we've got here is we've got this block span and this posted at, and called time ago in words micropost created at. Okay, time ago in words is a helper built into Rails. So if you try calling this method from, say, just your model, that's a little bit tricky. So here's a second view that also had the same time ago in words for, this is the micropost for your little post, how long ago it's created at. So what does this look like when you put it into the decorator? It looks like this. All you do is create the decorator, and there's a generator will generate this for you from Draper. It'll extend the Draper decorator, and I just made the method called posted_ago, and what that does, it wraps up that whole block of the tag, and here's a little bit of secret sauce there. Call H to get the helper methods. I actually like that a little bit better than the way everything's kind of a little mysterious in the controller and the view and what gets called and what doesn't get called. So you got to call H. It doesn't just get automatically included. And then you call the helper. And then you have this object, which is your original object when the decorator gets instantiated. I'll show you how it gets instantiated in just a second. So one of the things you do when you have these decorators is you can have them delegate to the model. And that's actually what's commonly done. And then there will be you'll basically include, there's a Draper command that'll do that. You don't have to do that. That's one of the objections people have to using Draper, and that's why I didn't put it in here, is they think when you create this decorator, all you've done is just made an even fatter model, and that gets confusing. So instead what you can always do is you can call your decorator.object. You can write tests for the decorators. And then here's where it's used. So when I cleaned up that, it's called feed item, and that was our original model object, .decorate, .posted_ago. So you see how easy that is? You just call .decorate on your model object and then your method. And there's some other twists and turns to doing that, but that's basically it. So does Draper work for me? It works for me. It's simple. Okay, here's the next pattern, the presenters pattern. So let's take a look at this. This is actually pretty simple as well. So here's my controller. So I've got here is a couple controller methods that we're instantiating 4 variables. Look, this is probably not the best example of using this technique because 4 variables is not very complicated. But so just kind of imagine this with even more and more instance variables. And so what does it look like is that instead of having those 4 instance variables there, we're going to call my presenter equals my presenter class dot new with the parameters. And I'm passing in there the parameters that I need to calculate the values. So think about what's happening here is I'm just creating this object that's going to get used by the view later. I'm not actually running all those queries and doing those things in the controller. So here's what my follow presenter looks like. And once you create a few of these, you can literally do a lot of this with just search and replace by copying that little bit of code in there. And like here would have been @title equals type 2s italicize. So what we do is we create this constructor here with the initializers. And then these are all the methods below. What I'm doing here is I'm memoizing the values, and these get called by the view. And it's also quite nice to even just put your definition of your cache key in there. So here's what the view looks like. Instead of having a lot of different instance variables, I know everything is going through my presenter. So if you look at this, like here, @user.user.name, that becomes @presenter.user.name. So you can do a lot of this stuff with search and replace. There's some other additional techniques in these diffs, and these are on GitHub, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see this, but like using a subclass to eliminate those if statements I was just showing on the screen. There's another change here where you can break this up using separate controllers and some little bits of code there about how you fix the issue with when you have nested modules inside of a resource. A little tricky setting that up, so it's a good example of that. Okay, let's take a look at the original main, what I thought was going to be the biggest part of my talk was the original fat method here. Oh, let's see, right. Okay. So here we go. So this is probably like, I think this is probably a little more code than this here demonstrates the business case that we had. And the key thing about this controller method, it's a little bit big. It's not humongous compared to some controller methods. And you probably, the average Rails programmer would go and take a look at this and just see that the code here it's quite clean. It's got a couple private methods. And most people would think with a few tests, hey, that was really pretty great. But get your code reviewed by the right people, and you'll find out that you can actually do a little bit better. So we're setting stuff on the user. We're putting stuff in here that really should be validated at the micro post. We're setting the flash here, and that should be in the controller. This is a special case right there, this if statement. And originally, this was the code. This is the way the code started out. So the first step in this code was right here, to move the validation, move that method, just the profane words of the private method down below inside the micropost. So then I just, create validation. Look, validation, no one would call that a pattern. This is just a way to use Rails better. And one of the reasons why this makes sense, just in the concept of it's the right thing to do, is because later on, if you create some other controller and it needs to put stuff in there, the information's coming from a different place, then you might forget to call that validation. And then I've got plenty of tests in there, so lots of good examples for how to write raw spec tests. So the next change, and this is a bigger change, is I took this whole block of code and I just put it in the micro post and called this save with profanity callbacks. So there I got, and also I take this block of code here, sending the parent notification on the user, and just threw that over in the user model. Although that is questionable whether or not maybe it should really go there. Let's see. So next thing, so in the micro post, now it's got this method, save with the profanity callbacks. So and look, and this is not the final step. And I go through a few more steps. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back to slides here. So here is the excessive model logic in the complicated controller method. So here's basically the technique was make sure you're using Rails real well. So here's the final, this is the biggest, thing about, the talk. What was the thing that I learned going through this talk was, number one of all, make sure that you use plain old Rails. Use them, know where to put the different things, where model, validation, and controller go, put them in the right place for the proper jobs. So don't invent patterns that don't need to be invented. And know the why. So part of this, too, is the why. Why does stuff go into a model? Why does it go in the view? Why does it go in the controller? In order to understand, knowing where you're going to know the right place, you got to know the why stuff. There's actually, I apologize. OK, this one. There's a quote. One of my quotes I'm missing I want to do. I want to give special thanks out to all the people that are listed on the slide. They helped me review the place. This is my headquarters in Maui. And all this stuff, if any of you have seen my blog, I try to put just lots of helpful articles on the blog. That's kind of how I find people to contact me about interesting projects they might need. Does anybody, and I want to thank you all for coming in this talk. I apologize, it's not easy to go through the code. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you all so much for coming.